Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So this is going to be part 3 of the Ultimate Tanking Guide, and in this part we will be talking about everything to do with tanking cooldowns specifically, from management to classification and general approach and usage. We're going to be going over them, however, from a general tanking perspective, and I will leave in-depth breakdowns that are job specific to other videos like my Ultimate Guide videos that I have done on each tank for my channel already. So if you're looking for something a little bit more specific, then head over onto one of those videos and I'll guide you right through all of the details for them. So likewise, though, if you are looking for a specific part of this guide or other information from this Ultimate Tanking Guide, I should have a breakdown in the description for each part. So if cooldowns isn't what you're looking for, then check out there, and I have lots of great other stuff. This section on cooldowns is going to be divided into two unique sections. First off, we're going to be talking about the mentality of cooldowns, how you should be approaching, using them in general, and how you can manage to get the most out of them. Of course, though, this is going to be a very general approach to tanking and tank cooldowns, and we will be limited in scope and coverage to that. There is an exception to every rule, they say, and that's definitely going to be the case here for some of these tanks. Secondly, we will break up the tank cooldowns into their different sections and start to cover their use cases based on what category they fall under. So let's start this off with the mentality of cooldowns, and this is probably the most important section of the video. And if you take away only one section of this video, I really hope that this is the one that you take away. So cooldowns are a part of the tank's primary function. They should not actually be considered as just a tacked on accessory as opposed to their actual role of apparently just doing damage and holding aggro. In fact, as soon as you've looked at tanking like you just are acting as a DPS that just holds aggro, then you've honestly failed some of the most fundamental parts of being a tank. If you actually look back to the first part of this Ultimate Tanking Guide, I said that your role is to facilitate and contribute to the optimal destruction of targets, minimizing damage taken to optimize healers also maximizing their DPS. So is that a part of doing your role? To do great damage? Yeah, absolutely. But that's not all it is. An optimal destruction of targets also means that you are going to be needing able to pull massively large packs of mobs and not get immediately crunched under the weight of all of them. And believe me, with the size of some of the packs you pull, that happens. But the next point is to optimize your healer's ability to deal damage, which also ultimately can and does even translate into the Astrologian's ability to keep you alive, throw out cards, and buff allies' DPS, while contributing their own damage. And that's something that some people brought up in one of my past videos, and I kind of looked and was like, do you really expect an Astrologian to not only throw out their own damage, but also to heal and keep you alive through all that, and manage their cards as you're getting crushed under the feet of 30 mobs? Well, I hope that you don't, because oof. Speaking as someone who has played Ast with tanks that didn't use cooldowns, oof. But jokes aside, your cooldowns do way more than just reduce your damage taken in the grand scheme of things. They really freely up yourself to do even more and manipulate the battlefield strategically, while also enabling your healer to maximize their true human potential. Or Lalafell potential. World of Warcraft reference, oh no. So that's all nice and good, but generally speaking, when should I use cooldowns? You might be surprised at how often I am actually asked this question. Generally speaking, the best time to use cooldowns is at the start of a pull, or close to the start. Cooldowns work best as a way to prevent an "oh no" moment, rather than as a response to one. Few obvious exceptions apply, of course, but generally speaking, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Or rather, a single cooldown can save your entire team's sanity in a wipe. For example, let's take Rampart. This ability will reduce damage by 20% for the grand total of 20 seconds. And this would be a really cool ability to use at the start of a pull, where you could get hit a tremendous amount of times over the course of 20 seconds. Let's say you get hit by 5k damage by 10 mobs once every 3 seconds. That's going to be 50k damage incoming every 30 seconds. That's going to be quite painful. But with Rampart, you would take only 40k damage instead of 50. And is that still a lot of damage? Oh yeah, absolutely. Your healer is going to be working. But when you're pulling and tanking, every bit of this really does count towards the total. Essentially, you prevented 10k damage there just from pressing a button, and it's not even on a global cooldown. And so over the course of 20 seconds, we'd get, let's say 20 divided by 3, so about 6 of these 3-second intervals during that time. That would be a total reduction of about 60k damage just because you pressed a single button. And honestly, that's pretty good. That means that you needed 60k less healing, and that does translate into quite a bit of healing in your time. If you're doing, say, massive wall-to-wall pulls. If I'm being super blunt, it probably makes a difference between you being folded like a flimsy plastic chair under a sumo wrestler versus being a reinforced metal toilet seat. You're probably less likely to cease to exist when using Rampart. So use Rampart. But as I said earlier, use cooldowns early. And what would that look like if you used Rampart at the very end? Let's just look at it for instance. Well, as the calculation above suggests, Rampart was much more effective at soaking and reducing incoming damage over time. Each set of 50,000 damage from those mobs came at 3-second intervals. So let's suppose that you let these mobs attack and whack you until you got to 10% health, and then you were in trouble. You finally popped Rampart at this 10% health margin. Gotta save myself now, right? Well, in the end, 20% is significant overall, but it is probably not enough to turn the tides at this point, and your healer is probably freaking. In reality, cooldowns should be thought of as the most part over like a long-term contribution, rather than a sprint or a burst. There are, of course, exceptions like the Warrior's Equilibrium ability that restores a burst of their own HP back, but just generally speaking here, most do not work that way, and that is an exception. That lands us into the next topic. Should you stack defensive cooldowns? Generally speaking, no. But there are some situations where it's very useful, like say you have a tank buster coming in, and then you're on a Dark Knight, and you combine Dark Mind, which is a massive magic mitigation, along with the Blackest Night, which is a massive shield, and this lets you shrug off a tank buster. Or take Warrior's Thrill of Battle, which boosts the amount of healing that they get as well as their maximum HP, as well as use Equilibrium, and then that combines together to be a massive spike of self-healing. But if we're talking in general, it's more often better to spread out your cooldowns over time. Take Rampart for instance. While it does last 20 seconds, which is a fairly long time for a tank cooldown, it does have a significantly longer 90-second cooldown timer. And if I'm being honest, that's one of the lighter cooldown timers. Take Warrior's Vengeance cooldown, and that's a whopping 120-second cooldown timer for only 15 seconds of protection. And always go in with protection into tanking. With these longer cooldowns, it's generally better to spread them out over a longer period of time rather than to burst them all down and leave yourself with minimal defenses for a prolonged period of time. That is generally speaking though. Tank busters and other mechanics that do warrant a lot of stacking do happen. Each class does have a shorter cooldown ability though that I should bring up, and we will elaborate a little bit more on this in a few short moments, and that this can be effectively spammed. So to say such as Gunbreaker has Heart of Stone that is available for use every 25 seconds and reduces the damage taken by 15% for 7 seconds. And these are fantastic little abilities to weave together with other cooldowns or to spam alone to break up the monotonous incoming damage. In fact, for some of the most painful tank busters in the game, I would commonly give my main tank my Heart of Stone cooldown to reduce their damage at the same time as they pop their big cooldowns themselves, like Dark Mind, the Blackest Night at the same time on themselves, and then that allowed me to also contribute to their defense, and they would shrug off an otherwise decimating tank buster like it was nothing. In fact, I think sometimes you wouldn't even break through the shield. It was ridiculous. But that being said, we can talk a bit more about combos as we talk through the cooldowns in general, leading us into the next section. And this section is the second one, which is going to be breaking down cooldowns into sections. And this is going to give and involve a bit of making a table just to kind of sort things through, because we have a few sections that I generally classify each tank cooldown under, and as we go through this table from top to bottom, it is my hope that you will get a good feel for each and all of the situations that they might be appropriate for. So each tank gets at least one ability that falls under each category. If you want details on them, I'd point you to check out my ultimate guides for the tanks. I have them up on this channel and they go into really good detail. So first off, I'm going to start with what I call the short cooldowns. Each tank gets some mitigation on an extremely short cooldown timer. The Dark Knight, for instance, gets the Blackest Night that is on a ridiculously short 15-second cooldown timer. Yes, I said 15 seconds, which is insane, but really powerful. The longest, however, of these so-called short would be, in reality, the short 25-second timer for the Gunbreaker's Heart of Stone ability. These in general are going to be fairly spammable. You get them up so quickly that it's not as painful to use and toss here and there and everywhere, honestly, to soak up damage wherever you can. But as you do get more familiar with fights, you can use it to stack up mitigation to eat up tank busters like they were cheesecake. Cheesecake. Now, the next section that I'm going to follow up after this is going to be a section that I call support or off-tank skills. You're going to see the connection to the first one and why I did this as my second pretty soon. And I sort of feel ridiculous calling this a support or off-tank skills, because other than for the Paladin, all of these skills can totally be used on yourself and or have some massively beneficial effect for yourself. So when off-tanking in a raid scenario, you rarely are going to be the one taking the brunt of the damage. And yes, tank swaps are a thing. Totally acknowledge that. Already acknowledged it in this series. Gonna acknowledge it more in future mechanics. But on the other hand, you really want to make sure that you are really going to be doing as much as you can as the co-tank, as the off-tank at that time, to make sure that they just don't get crushed like a pop can. And that's gonna happen regardless if you are the one being spanked by the boss or not. And so some of these mechanics totally include tank busters, they include raid-wide AoE damage, they include various other mechanics like tethers, incoming damage that you need to intercept and walk into. There's quite a few ones. And that is exactly where the support skills come in handy. Take for instance the Gunbreaker's Heart of Stone and Aurora skills. One increases the damage mitigation and the other provides a powerful trickle of healing to the tank. With that being said, these are also skills that you can use on yourself, and please do, they're really powerful. And the same thing for the Warrior and Dark Knight with their respective skills. There is one big drawback though. These skills are usually tied to the same cooldown as the short cooldown that we just talked about previously in the table. Minus Gunbreaker's Aurora, or Paladin's Clemency of course, this is going to result in you really having to make the choice between boosting your own defenses by doing something like using the Dark Knight's Blackest Night on yourself, or using the Dark Knight's Blackest Night on your main tank. But given how quick that these cooldowns do come back, you'll usually be able to learn when you can tank swap or when you are able to do this, and it's rarely an issue in my experience. Like, for me personally, last patch when I raided Savage with Gunbreaker, I will fully confess here that I kind of spammed Aurora and Heart of Stone onto my main tank if I didn't need to save them for something like a tank buster or some impressively difficult mechanic. And sometimes life really is just that simple. In fact, I'd say that the worst thing that you could do is to not use these abilities when they are available as an off-tank. Every shot not taken is a shot missed? How did that go again? So before I'm done with this section, I do want to say that there is a unique subclass that I do want to highlight that I think is really cool. Healing abilities, which can be very powerful for the tank themselves, but for Paladin and the Gunbreaker, make extremely excellent off-tank utility to help boost survivability of their partner. And of course the Warriors, no doubt, no doubt. The unfortunate truth though is that the Dark Knight is a bit exempt here because they can't really directly heal their allies, but the Blackest Night, however, stands as unique utility because the other tanks can't shield, but the Dark Knight can shield, and so that is an extremely powerful ability to have because you don't need to worry about concepts like overhealing in that. Again, Dark Knight Ultimate Guide would be much more in depth with that though. And so now, since we're already talking about utility, the next category is going to be Partywide Mitigation, and that kind of falls under the umbrella of utility, so let's go with that. Which, as you can see here, the Paladin is getting the most by an absolutely ridiculously large margin here. Paladin gets Divine Veil, Cover, and Passage of Arms, the specifics of which are best left for the Paladin guide, but generally speaking, they serve the same basic idea as the rest of the Partywide utility abilities. These abilities are on respectively longer cooldown times, and they average about 90 seconds, and they act as a way to mitigate damage from the raid as a complete whole, from things like area of effect sources of damage. That being said, these abilities are not lacking in the single target mitigation department. Take for instance the Gunbreaker's Heart of Light ability here. This will reduce the magic damage taken by the Gunbreaker themselves by 10% for 15 seconds as well, so it's not just party-wide. And like in that instance, when it is stacked with other cooldowns, can help the Gunbreaker eat a extremely painful tank buster even better than they normally could. And really, when you'd use that really does depend on the context, if it would be more helpful than if the Gunbreaker had just used it for a raid-wide AoE that the boss uses, which is probably, generally speaking, the best use case for the abilities listed here, but I do want to remind people that, hey, you can also use it just for yourself if you want to mitigate personal damage. Next section is, there's not too much to really say on it. Next up is your big, heavy mitigation abilities. These are your biggest, strongest mitigation abilities on their own. And so each tank gets one of these, and all of them have a standard 120-second cooldown timer and a 30% damage mitigation for 15 seconds. The Warriors does have attacked on damage reflect, but that might be getting a little too specific for this video, but Warrior, interestingly enough, does get that perk. Generally speaking, though, if you're about to eat a tank buster, this should be immediately one of your go-to buttons. Or if you're pulling wall to wall during that initial burst of 15 seconds of big mitigation, that's really going to help you stabilize during that pull. Next up is a set of abilities that, unlike the other abilities in this table, actually acts as your oh no, something went horribly wrong, get out of here, button. And that is your invulnerability buttons. So each of these buttons comes with its own sets of pros and its own sets of cons per tank. They are actually pretty diverse in how you're going to use them and what time it's going to be best to use, as well as the impact on your healer. For instance, the Paladin is completely immune to damage, whereas the Gunbreaker, as soon as they click theirs, is immediately brought to 1 HP and then immune. So definitely a lot of pros and cons. And in the Gunbreaker's case, you also scare your healer quite a bit. And so these cooldowns can be planned in order to so-called cheese a mechanic, or in more human terms, if there is a mechanic that you really don't want to deal with, or a set of tank busters that would be an insanely difficult challenge or arduous task to handle, just pop your invulnerability and pretend that mechanic never even existed. Yay! And you might think I'm joking there, but I'm actually flat out serious that many groups for endgame content plan around their invulnerability ability usage purely to get around nasty mechanics if they don't want to deal with them. Which seems to shock a lot of new players, but yeah, really, if you want to change something up, use it. And now finally is the last row of the table, and I'm honestly not sure what to class this under if I'm being super honest. Job flavor, extra additional ability that doesn't really lump in anywhere perfectly that great. And I'm gonna go with job flavor here because honest truth is that I'm just trying to ram these few abilities into other sections before, and it was just weird. The section really does boil down to Warrior gets 2 tools to modify their own HP, Dark Knight gets the ability to become a literal vampire stealing HP and have strong magic mitigation, and Gunbreaker gets another Rampart ability, which might sound lame, but Rampart is an absolutely glorious ability and is like the workhorse of the tanks in general, so why not have another one? Rampart's awesome, and so having a second one is, in my books at least, really big. And Paladin, the section's a little barren. It really gets all those extra utility abilities above for party mitigation like cover and passage of the arms and Divine Veil. And so kind of outside of the table, because it isn't really to the tanks like for each, but it's like for all of them, is something we call role actions. So these are available for every single tank. And so Rampart, as I just said, is a fantastic 20-second duration, 20% mitigation workhorse of the tank class. This ability is huge for all tanks and should be popped early on in a pull or fight. And honestly, this ability, you're going to be using it a heck of a lot as a tank. It is so good. In a very similar vein, we have Arm's Length, which when you do a big dungeon pull, will slow the mobs that hit you, meaning that they're going to attack less and less. And that's going to honestly dramatically reduce damage taken for a period of time. And this is honestly a really underestimated ability, but it is super spectacular if I am being super honest. It is so good when you use it in a dungeon. Unfortunately, is it useful in raid scenarios? No, because bosses aren't going to be impacted by slow effect, but still, in dungeons, oh, so good. And lastly, Reprisal, and this is extremely powerful ability that also seems to be underappreciated. This ability will lower the damage that all enemies around you deal by 10% for 10 seconds, and that is at a staggeringly low 60-second cooldown time. So once every minute, for 10 seconds, you can lower all the damage taken from all mobs hitting you for 10 seconds. And that being area effect now, that's actually a fairly recent change, makes it extremely worth spamming in dungeons, even if it's at quote-unquote inopportune times. But generally speaking, it is also a magnificent ability for raid situations where you can reduce raid-wide AoE damage or reducing tank buster damage. And remember though that every piece of mitigation counts for those heaviest of heavy tank busters, because trust me, they will blow your tank out of the water like really bad. So now that that table is done, that's actually kind of like the overview of the tank abilities and generally speaking where I'd put their use case and use them. Truth is, each tank has its own separate ultimate guide that dives into the specifics of each ability, but as a general breakdown, I'm feeling pretty confident that if you match these abilities in this table to the ultimate guide, that you'd have a really good feel on what matches up where and generally how you could use them. That being said, there are a lot of different combos, and far too many to try and get into in a single video like this in my opinion. Like, let's say that you're a warrior main tank and that you use Nascent Flash to burn up your health, or burst up your health I mean, and in that situation that you have a Dark Knight co-tank using the Blackest Night on you, then oh no, what do you do? Am I gonna need that HP? Am I not? Is the shield gonna be enough? Is it not? I don't know, it's going to really depend on that context. Or let's say that you're a gunbreaker off tank with a warrior main tank and a raid AoE is coming up, oh no. Then you'd want to use things like the warrior would use Shake It Off, probably with the reprisal debuff on the boss, while the gunbreaker, you yourself, uses Heart of Light. At the end of the day, tanking is more than just whacking mobs and holding aggro, but it is also in assembling these separate pieces together and making a single cohesive whole strategy to take down and plan on how to best survive through a fight. And that's what's gonna ultimately bring us to our next video topic, on topic 4, where we will really start to break down more on what tanking is, specifically what mechanics you're gonna need to deal with. And we're gonna start to introduce some of these pieces and show how awesome they are in action in conjunction with one another. So if you like this video though, I'd super duper appreciate any likes and subscribes that you give. They really go a long way to helping me, and your support is honestly so truly super appreciated. It really means the world to me. Anyhow, that is all for this part of the guide video. Stay tuned for the next update in the near future.